In the early Middle Ages, most Europeans lived in a patchwork of local customs and vague, unwritten expectations. You farmed, you got grain, you used the local stream, you drank water, you hunted a rabbit, you got stew. No one handed you an invoice for stepping outside your hut. And then something terrible happened. Somebody invented record keeping. Once lords and kings realized they could write down who used what, and then demand that these people pay for the privilege, things deteriorated. Slowly, quietly, expensively. Let's drift through a few highlights. 1. The forest you used to walk through. In Anglo-Saxon England, forests were forests. Trees, birds, bears if you were unlucky. People gathered firewood, foraged, maybe hunted a rabbit if the Lord wasn't nearby. Then the Normans arrived in 1066. William the Conqueror, a man whose hobbies included warfare, castle building, and making life mildly unbearable for peasants, decided forests should belong exclusively to him, not the trees, mind you, the animals in them. So suddenly, walking into a forest was suspicious. Picking up fallen wood was a timber offense. Hunting a deer without permission could cost you a hand, an eye, or if the mood was particularly medieval, both. Some manuscripts describe peasants losing the right to even own hunting dogs, unless the dog's front claws were surgically removed, just in case it had dreams of catching a rabbit. Naturally, peasants were upset, but kings have a way of not noticing peasant opinions unless the peasants arrive with torches and a short-term policy proposal called a rebellion. So the forests that once fed local families were suddenly picked to play. Congratulations, nature is now a subscription service. 2. The river you drank from. Most medieval villages had a river, stream, or pond nearby. That was the water supply. People didn't buy bottled water from a grinning man named Aquavax, 1100, at the market. They just drank the water. Until someone with a crown realized, again, technically, that water is flowing across my land. In the 12th and 13th centuries, nobles began charging water rights fees. This is exactly what it sounds like, paying rent on the river. Bills might include fishing fees, water drawing fees, milling fees, bridge tolls for standing on the wrong boards. Many lords built small dams or mills and then charged anyone who wanted to use the machinery, even if the village had been milling grain there for generations. Imagine going to your favorite public bench and suddenly finding, to sit here, 1 squirrel pelt per hour. That was medieval water management. 3. Roads were free. Until they weren't. Early medieval roads were dirt paths that people used because, what else were you going to do? Fly. No one owned a road. Roads were simply the places the cows hadn't completely eaten. But as trade increased, lords realized something important. Merchants had coin. Merchants needed roads. Merchants could be encouraged to hand over that coin by building toll gates and saying, in essence, pay me or walk through the swamp. Many towns set up toll booths outside their gates, where officials collected fees based on whatever you were carrying. The list could be surprisingly creative. A toll per sack of grain, a toll per donkey, a toll per wheel. Occasionally a toll just for existing, what was politely called the head fee. And the best part, if another lord owned the next stretch of road, you might pay again the same afternoon. Early medieval road travel was basically a medieval subscription bundle. For only 12 tolls per journey, you too can experience the luxury of not drowning in a bog. 4. Bread ovens. The medieval paywall. Everyone in medieval Europe needed fire for cooking. Baking bread at home seems like the most normal thing on earth, which is why, of course, nobles banned it. In much of medieval France, England, and the Holy Roman Empire, lords established the banal oven. This was the lord's official baking oven, usually located in the village center, and peasants were required legally to bake their bread there, for a fee. If you dared bake bread at home, the lord could fine you, confiscate your tools, or, in some spirited areas, burn your illegal oven to the ground. Imagine a medieval village gossip session. Did you hear Agnes is baking at home again? The criminal, I know. Next thing, she'd be watering her plants without royal consent. The logic was simple. If peasants needed something, lords wanted to own it. Ovens went from a household necessity to a medieval gym membership. You paid low monthly rates, you shared the equipment, you tried not to think about how unsanitary everything was. 5. The winepress scandal. Many regions of medieval Europe had grapes. Not fancy Bordeaux grapes, just grapes. People used them to make the local version of wine. which tasted somewhat like vinegar and somewhat like regret. Crushing grapes required a press. In early medieval life, families or villagers often shared communal presses. Then brace yourself lords discovered that they could own the press, charge peasants to use it, and occasionally add an additional fee per squished grape. This became known as banalite, the right of the lord to force peasants to use his equipment for grinding, crushing, or processing goods. You weren't allowed to own your own press, build a new one, use someone else's. Some peasants paid more for wine pressing than they earned selling the wine, an early example of business innovation meeting crushing despair. 6. The right to marry, please pay here. You'd think marriage was a personal decision involving at least some mutual consent. Not so much. Under the medieval system of serfdom, many peasants couldn't marry without the lord's official permission, which surprise came with a fee. If a serf wanted to marry someone from another estate, the receiving lord might also require payment, meaning marriage involved to families, to lords, and twice the administrative paperwork. And if you didn't pay, the marriage could be refused, fined later, or declared invalid. Imagine trying to explain to your grandchildren, oh yes, Grandma and Grandpa fell deeply in love, but couldn't afford the paperwork in 1286. Some lords even charged a death fine when a peasant man died and the widow wanted to stay in her home, because grief, apparently, was taxable. 7. Monastic toll collection. Monasteries, in theory, were places of prayer and self-denial. In practice, many became highly efficient financial operations. Monks charged for bridge crossings, ferry rides, market permits. Tithes, special tithes, emergency tithes. We just remembered another tithes. Some monks controlled salt production, mills, breweries, and even entire fishing ports. So while many lived humbly, others existed in a comfortable position, known historically as, God wants us to have this castle. Some peasants complained. Clergymen, being spiritual leaders, responded by commissioning stained glass windows about obedience. 8. Public land privatization, medieval edition. Before the medieval world went fully feudal, many villagers worked communal farm plots. Everyone shared responsibility, and everyone shared the harvest. Then lords began enclosing land, putting up fences, hedges, or simple keep-out signs written in Latin so peasants could not argue. This transformed. Shared pastures gives private grazing rights. Village woodlands gives rental timber forests. Meadows gives private hayfields. Peasants who de-used those lands for generations now had to lease access from the very people who de-fenced off what used to be free. It was essentially medieval real estate flipping, except without home staging or pastel-painted kitchens. Enclosure didn't always happen violently, but it always happened profitably for the person with the fence. 9. Even collecting fallen sticks became a crime in many regions of England and France. Peasants could no longer gather fallen branches, wind-blown firewood, pine cones, dead brush, even though these items were literally lying on the ground doing nothing, because the Lord decided that trees belonged to him. And if trees belonged to him, then fallen wood did too. Peasants had to pay for the right to collect firewood in many areas. Enforcement varied, in some regions, fines in others, beatings or imprisonment in extreme Norman areas. Mutilation of the body. You know things have gone wrong when picking up a stick feels like a dangerous heist mission. 10. Free markets. With fees, markets existed since the dawn of towns. People showed up, traded goods, and went home. Then marketplaces became charters, and charters meant permits, and permits meant fees. First, you paid to bring goods in, then you paid for your stall. Sometimes you paid for the right two-way items on the official lord-maintained scales, which naturally also earned a fee. If a merchant wanted to avoid the market and sell directly to peasants, some towns fined the merchant, the peasant, or both, because nothing ruins a noble's day like someone else not paying him. Why did this happen? 2 reasons. 1. Lords wanted revenue, war, armor, horses, castles, crusades, hunting dogs, all expensive. At some point, monarchs and nobles looked at peasants and realized, ah yes, renewable revenue. 2. Because they could. Medieval law wasn't centralized. Power meant being able to enforce rules, not necessarily justify them. If a noble decided to start charging peasants 5 eggs a year for air use, peasants would either pay rebel or move somewhere less ridiculous, and most couldn't move. But did people push back? Yes. Some of the most famous medieval revolts happened because of fees. The Peasants' Revolt of 1381 in England, sparked by unfair taxes, feudal obligations, and the growing list of things peasants now had to pay for. The Jacquerie in France, 1358. Frustration with noble taxes during the 100 Years' War. Countless village-level rebellions, many lost to history, often because medieval scribes did not consider peasant anger historically important. Still, the pattern was consistent. Something had been free. A noble found a way to monetize it. Peasants briefly considered an uprising. History continued. Soft transition to the next section. Let's drift onward. Because if there's anything medieval monarchs excelled at besides warfare, poor hygiene, and questionable medical advice, it was discovering new fees no one had ever needed before. In the next part of our evening journey, we'll explore the strange, petty, and often deeply unwise personal lives of medieval royals, the people who invented many of these charges in the first place. Sleep if you want. Keep listening if you don't. Either way, we're staying in the Middle Ages a little longer. Hey everyone, if you're still awake, congratulations. If not, well, someone now has medieval history seeping into their dreams, and that's probably healthier than most medieval medicine. We're staying in the Middle Ages, and now we're redrifting toward the thrones, toward the royal families who invented many of the systems that made daily life just slightly worse for everyone else. If you imagine medieval royalty as elegant, well-groomed people in embroidered robes, making wise and noble decisions, you have definitely been influenced by modern costume dramas, because in reality, many kings and queens were just exhausted, undereducated, suspicious, and doing their best in a world where their uncle might poison them for a better chair tonight. We're going to look at several royals who were not terrible because they were evil, though some certainly were, but because they were profoundly petty, insecure, and catastrophically human. Soft voices, slow breathing. Let's drift in. 1. Charles VI of France. The king who forgot he was a king. Charles VI came to the throne in 1380 at the mature age of 11, which in medieval royal years is practically retirement age. France had just lived through the Black Death, a peasant revolt, and massive taxation. The bar was already low. Charles began his reign well. People liked him. He showed intelligence and promise. Then, one day, while traveling with his soldiers, he snapped. He attacked his own men in a fit of madness, killing several before finally being subdued. From then on, his mental health unraveled like medieval twine. His court noted sudden violent episodes, paranoia periods, where he refused to bathe, and most famously, believing he was made of glass. Yes, the King of France was terrified someone would bump into him and cause disaster. Court servants had to move carefully around him. Some even reinforced his clothes with iron rods to reassure him he wouldn't tea-shatter during state functions. Imagine being a medieval noble, waiting months for a royal audience, and then spending the entire meeting consulting a monarch who worried that sitting down too quickly might break his femur like a wine goblet. His government slowly collapsed into chaos. Factions formed. His wife, Queen Isabeau of Bavaria, became an unpopular political force. His brother became a rival. Burgundians and Armagnacs plunged the kingdom into nearly constant civil war. And England, watching from across the channel, said what any opportunistic foreign monarchy would say: we should invade that. So France's slide into catastrophe, the one that opened the door to Henry V, was nudged along in part by a king who might reasonably have been given medical treatment, but instead continued ruling because medieval Europe had a strict, unwritten healthcare policy known as, "Does he have a crown? Then let him keep working." 2. King John of England, the original overdraft fee. King John gets a lot of bad press, some of it deserved, some perhaps exaggerated, but his political style could best be summarized as taxing the same people in the same year for the same thing. But louder, his father, Henry II, and his brother, Richard the Lionheart, had already stretched England financially through war and crusading. John inherited that debt and responded in the least helpful way possible. We'll tax everyone, and then tax them again. Examples included relief fees, inheritance charges that ballooned absurdly, marriage fees for noble families, even when the marriages benefited no one, forest law expansion, meaning even more fines for picking up sticks, random arbitrary seizures of property. Because why not? John once demanded that the widow of a nobleman pay £4,000 to inherit her own lands, about the yearly income of over 250 knights. Her name was Matilda de Braus, and when she couldn't pay, John imprisoned her and her son, locking them up until they starved to death. It did not make him popular. But perhaps the most English piece of history is this. Eventually the barons got tired of paying for King John's poor life choices and forced him to sign Magna Carta, essentially saying, "Please stop behaving like this." John immediately tried to break the agreement, starting a civil war. He died shortly after, possibly from dysentery, possibly from eating too many late-night peaches and cider. Medieval sources differ, but either way, it was a fittingly unpleasant end. Even centuries later, his legacy remains in one phrase historians love to repeat. Well, at least he wasn't as bad as John. High praise. 3. Charles II of Navarre, medieval agent of chaos. If the Middle Ages had an official mascot for petty political sabotage, it was Charles II of Navarre, better known to history as Charles the Bad. Historians don't usually nickname kings the Bad unless they've earned something special. Charles was born with royal blood and dynamite-level ambition. Unfortunately, he lacked diplomatic talent, long-term strategy, and basic human restraint. He spent his career poisoning rivals, betraying allies, switching sides in wars, and sometimes switching back the same afternoon when France and England were locked in the 100 Years' War. Charles did not pick a side. He simply asked, "Which of you is paying more today?" Even chroniclers of the time, many of whom were used to petty, lethal politics, were baffled by the creativity of his treachery. At one point, he supposedly tried to pay a German alchemist to produce poison vapor, potent enough to eliminate entire rooms of people. This would have made him a medieval Bond villain, if Bond had existed, and if anyone at the time had indoor plumbing. His dramatic end is one of the most quoted in medieval history. According to several chroniclers, he became ill, his healers wrapped him in brandy-soaked linens, a servant attempted to tie off the bandages, and instead, because fate loves comedy, the linen ignited. Charles burned to death because someone got too close with a candle. Now, historians are cautious with the story. It may have been exaggerated or symbolic. Medieval chroniclers loved a poetic ending, but the tale fits so well with the rest of his life that people keep telling it anyway. 4. Isabella of France, the queen who said no. Absolutely not. Isabella of France married Edward II of England, a king famous for annoying his nobles, spending lavishly on favorites, and inventing new and exciting ways to make Parliament consider resignation. Edward's favorite nobles, Piers Gaveston and later Hugh Despencer, controlled royal access, royal gifts, and royal lands. Parliament hated them. The barons hated them. Most of the kingdom hated them. Isabella hated them the most, largely because the royal treasury was being emptied while she was left scraping for influence. Eventually, Isabella did something medieval queens were not really supposed to do. She raised an army. With the assistance of Roger Mortimer, she invaded England, overthrew the king's government, executed Hugh Despencer in a manner one historian described delicately as not subtle, and forced Edward to abdicate. Isabella then effectively ruled England on behalf of her underage son, until she was eventually overthrown herself in a palace coup. Isabella's popularity varies depending on whether the historian in question believed queens should be obedient or possibly smashing the government is justified if one's husband is truly unbearable. Either way, she earned her nickname, the She-Wolf of France, which medieval writers definitely intended as an insult, but today sounds metal enough to be a touring band. 5. Henry VI of England, medieval sleep mode. Henry VI became king as a baby. That never goes well. His father, Henry V, was a brilliant soldier, a conqueror, the hero of Agincourt. English chroniclers basically composed poetry about his cheekbones. Henry VI was not that. Soft-spoken, gentle, deeply religious, and possibly clinically depressed. Henry was the exact opposite of what 15th century aristocrats considered king material. He disliked war, he disliked swords, he disliked confrontations of any kind. Imagine being a medieval soldier wearing 60 pounds of armor and knowing that your king would much rather be cataloguing illuminated manuscripts in a nearby monastery. Henry also suffered from severe psychological breakdowns, one lasting over a year, during which he barely spoke or reacted. All this would have been fine if England had been in a period of peace. It was not. France was rising again under the leadership of Joan of Arc, and later, powerful French commanders. English fortunes collapsed. Nobles began asking whether God had revoked Henry's warranty. This question eventually led to Rival factions, political assassinations, and the Wars of the Roses. Henry himself was deposed, restored, and then deposed again, spending long periods in captivity, wandering mentally and physically. Some chroniclers pitied him. Others found him hopeless. One wrote, "His virtues were not made for the throne, but for the cloister." Many modern historians agree. He would have made an excellent monk. Unfortunately, he was born king. 6. Peter the Cruel of Castile. Branding is everything. Peter of Castile ruled in the 14th century and was known officially as Peter the Cruel. Well, that depends on who you asked. His supporters called him Peter the Just. His enemies called him Peter the Cruel, which says a lot about medieval public relations strategy. Nothing changes over time, except we now have social media to do the yelling for us. Peter was a reformer who tried to curb noble power. He also killed enemies with unsettling enthusiasm, including several family members. His half-brother, Henry of Trastamara, eventually overthrew him with French support. Chroniclers loyal to Henry naturally painted Peter as a villain. Later historians have spent centuries untangling which murders were politically convenient propaganda and which were, well, just murders. Either way, Peter lost the throne after a civil war and was killed supposedly after a dramatic hand-to-hand struggle with his brother, which just goes to show that medieval royal conflict always had the emotional maturity of a particularly tense family. Thanksgiving. 7. The House of Luxembourg. Sibling rivalry, but international. The Luxembourgs were a dynasty gifted with territory, bloodline, and a near supernatural ability to feud with one another. One of the most striking examples came with Wenceslas IV of Bohemia, whose reign was a spectacular display of political stalling, chronic indecision, and nobles attempting to overthrow him approximately twice per decade at one point. His own brother Sigismund kidnapped him twice, which gives you a sense of how productive family breakfasts must have been. Sigismund eventually became Holy Roman Emperor, meaning that while Wenceslas was being politely dethroned in Prague, his brother was being ceremonially crowned across Europe. It was not a harmonious household. Soft transition to the next section. Let's drift now from the throne rooms, with their politics, their velvet cushions, and their disappointingly flammable nightgowns, to a quieter place, a nursery, because while royal adults were often chaotic, their children were not always better off. In the next part, we'll float into the world of medieval royal childhood, a place filled with tutors who thought affection weakened the spine, political marriages arranged before the child had teeth, and medical advice that genuinely, earnestly recommended leeches. Let's get comfortable again. Deep breath in and out. Because we're entering one of history's most soothing disasters, the moment kings realized taxing peasants was easy. But taxing nobles was basically medieval self-harm. The problem with taxing people who own armor, peasants complained, but they didn't have many options beyond dramatic sighing and passive-aggressive farming. Nobles, however, had swords, had troops, had castles, and had a strong sense of entitlement. So when a king announced, "Good news, everyone must now pay a new fee," the nobles responded with something like, "We decline," sometimes politely, more often with troops. This led to a recurring medieval political cycle. King invents new tax. Nobles say no. King threatens force. Nobles remind king how many armored cousins they have. King graciously reconsiders a great system. France sets the tone. French kings were early adopters of tax innovation, and the nobility reacted in the most French way possible, refusing to cooperate while declaring themselves absolutely in the right. One of the earliest big confrontations came when kings introduced taxes to pay for wars in Italy, wars in England, wars in Spain, and occasionally wars against France itself, which is very efficient multitasking. French nobles, irritated, often held meetings to discuss refusal, exemptions, or the possibility that the king should simply stop spending so much. This did not go over well, but it established a timeless French principle. The king may be sovereign, but he is not the boss of us, at least not without paperwork. England learns the hard way. England had one of the most famous examples of noble pushback. King John, the human embodiment of a medieval customer service nightmare. John needed money for war, as kings do, and kept raising taxes. Nobles, tired of funding his losing streak, eventually forced him to sign something small and harmless called Magna Carta, a document saying, essentially, stop charging us for everything, get legal permission before taking our horses, and maybe stop jailing people just because you woke up annoyed. Reasonable requests, John signed it, then immediately ignored it, which led to the First Barons' War, a perfect example of medieval cause and effect. Overcharge customers gives customers, burn your castles. Scotland, passive-aggressive financial Scottish nobles had their own approach. The king would make a new tax announcement, and the nobles would respond with, absolutely, we'll pay. Very soon, definitely, no worries. Then proceed to pay nothing, or something like 14%, and occasionally a dried fish. Scottish monarchs eventually learned that they could pass any law they wanted, but collecting money was another matter entirely. It was like trying to run a country on promises and suspiciously light coin purses. The Holy Roman Empire, a complete tax circus if you haven't encountered the Holy Roman Empire before. Here's a soothing summary. Hundreds of nobles with titles, armies, and absolutely no interest in doing what the emperor said. Trying to tax them was like trying to collect subscription fees from house cats. Even emperors admitted, privately, they could propose taxes, but collecting them required charm, diplomacy, and possibly bribery. A few even confessed that being emperor was like having the title king, with the power of a moderately respected librarian. Spain, taxation through marriage. Spain went another route. Instead of trying to tax nobles directly, rulers often collected money through marriages, inheritance, dowries that mysteriously doubled themselves, and fees cleverly disguised as ceremonial gifts. In other words, they didn't charge nobles taxes, they just married the taxes out of them. A brilliant solution, except for the part where it created financially strained noble families, people marrying entirely for debt relief, and an entire generation of nobles staring at ledgers with the expression of someone slowly drowning in paperwork. Why kings needed the money? Let's not be too hard on medieval monarchs. They weren't taxing nobles for fun. Well, not only for fun, their expenses included paying soldiers, building castles, rebuilding castles after they were burned down, royal weddings, royal funerals, and treasury-funded family therapy, disguised as diplomatic missions. Also, war. Always war. Kings had a psychological condition we could call chronic involvement in conflict disorder. Symptoms include hearing rumors that neighboring lands exist, immediately declaring war, then asking taxpayers for money to fix the mess. It was a whole lifestyle. Soft transition. Now, let's take a slow breath and drift deeper, because while monarchs were testing how far you could push the nobility before they snapped, they found one group that could be taxed even more reliably: the church, a political minefield, a spiritual financial buffet. In part 4, we'll explore how kings learned to tax God's employees, why priests and bishops got very upset, and how the Pope occasionally responded by excommunicating entire governments, like a medieval unsubscribe button. If you're ready, just say, let's soften the lantern glow a little, because we're entering a moment in medieval history when rulers discovered something financially irresistible. The church had money, lots of it, and kings wanted it. This was bold, considering the church also had its own courts, its own armies, terrifying paperwork, and the nuclear option of medieval politics, excommunication, the medieval equivalent of being kicked out of heaven and society simultaneously. But kings were not known for thinking quietly before acting. So, here we go. The church was basically the largest landlord in Europe by the 12th century. The church owned monasteries, cathedrals, farms, vineyards, mills, entire towns, and sometimes the only latrines in the region that didn't inspire existential despair. All that land produced grain, livestock, rents, donations from sinners hoping for lighter sentences in the afterlife. Peasants liked paying the church better than the king, because at least the church promised something useful after death, whereas kings mostly promised war, taxes, and more war. Kings looked at these enormous church incomes and thought, we should absolutely get a piece of that. That was when problems began. The church's response? Absolutely not. The church had a standard position. God gets his tenth. The king gets whatever spare change monks felt like offering out of goodwill. This drove monarchs wild. Kings hated two ideas above all: people they couldn't tax, people richer than they were. The clergy qualified twice. The Pope had the ultimate taxing. If a king pushed too hard, the church could respond with one word: excommunication. The spiritual equivalent of being banned, blocked, unfollowed by heaven, and removed from the medieval Wi-Fi. People believed that if a king was excommunicated, their subjects didn't have to obey him. His oaths became invalid, and his soul was on track to roast forever like a medieval rotisserie chicken. So kings tested their luck carefully. Sometimes, England, the first big tax throwdown. Let's drift to England, where King John, yes, him again, demanded the church pay taxes for one of his many expensive wars. The Pope said, no. John said, yes. The church responded by shutting down religious services in England, suspending sacraments, leaving the entire kingdom spiritually offline. No weddings, no burials, no confession, no prayers with customer support. John ultimately backed down, not out of religious fear, but because the population was getting extremely upset, and revolts tend to interfere with medieval times. England resumed being holy, and John added another bullet point to his already impressive resume of historical failures. France. Kings play financial chess. French kings were more subtle. They attempted to tax the church the same way they taxed nobles, diplomatically at first, financially aggressive shortly after. King Philip IV, Philip the Fair, though some said he resembled a stubborn limestone statue, demanded church contributions for war. Pope Boniface VIII responded with a firm, absolutely not. Philip proceeded to escalate until the Pope issued the bull, Unum, reminding the world that the Pope outranked kings. Philip then escalated even further by sending troops to arrest the Pope, provoking an international scandal, and eventually strong-arming the next papacy. A remarkable lesson in medieval diplomacy. If you can't win the argument, kidnap the clergy. The church's other defense, spiritual interest rates. Since kings kept thinking up financial schemes, the church did too. One of their favorite countermeasures was spiritually weaponized math, the threat of eternal debt. Medieval sermons warned that kings might win gold on earth, but lose heavenly savings accounts, and medieval kings took this seriously. Many of them died donating land and money to the church at the last minute, hoping to settle accounts with God, get upgraded to first-class purgatory, avoid eternal legal disputes in hell. A surprisingly effective strategy. Monasteries get creative with accounting when kings started demanding audits. Monasteries responded in the most bureaucratic way possible. They produced ledgers thicker than agricultural manuals. These documents often showed astonishingly low revenues, suspiciously high expenses, and monks surviving on what looked like starvation budgets, all while the monastery mysteriously kept expanding with new refectories, stained glass, vineyards, extra bells. But kings rarely pressed the issue too hard. No monarch wanted to die knowing his soul might be investigated by celestial auditors. But occasionally, kings won. A few monarchs managed to extract church funding successfully. They did this by framing wars as holy, promising to defeat infidels, suggesting crusades, or outright bribing bishops with political favors. Sometimes the church agreed because they also wanted that war, or the Pope didn't like the other king involved, or they were just tired and wanted to go home. Diplomacy works in strange ways. Why this all mattered, this constant financial tug-of-war had long-term results. Kings slowly built power. The church slowly lost its financial autonomy, and Europe transitioned from God owns everything to the crown owns, well, most things. This evolution eventually helped produce centralized kingdoms, organized taxation systems, and modern states, which is impressive considering it all started with kings yelling at bishops for money. Soft transition. Let's exhale and drift ahead. Because while kings were fighting with the church over taxation, the people at the bottom of society, peasants, were quietly losing patience. In part 5, we'll float into the moment ordinary villagers said, actually, no, and uprisings began. A soothing tour through peasant revolts, medieval tax resistance, pitchfork economics, and why angry farmers always terrified kings more than foreign armies. When you're ready, just say, let's settle deeper into the pillows, because we're about to witness one of history's drowsiest explosive reactions, peasants finally reaching their limit. For centuries, the villages of Europe endured new taxes, the way one endures a slow leak in a ship, quietly, miserably, and hoping no one would notice. But eventually, someone did notice, and that someone usually had a pitchfork, a bad week, and absolutely no interest in royal financial policy. Tonight, we're drifting through several gentle, soothing uprisings. Let's begin. Why peasants eventually snapped. Medieval peasants had very simple economic goals. Grow enough crops to survive. Keep a little for winter. Not die of stress before age 40. But as taxes grew, money went to lords, tithes went to priests, forced labor went to public works, and the peasants were left with not much. Every year, the authorities seemed to announce new charges: a small fee for bridges, a mandatory contribution for the castle roof, a payment for the right to grind grain, breathe air, and continue existing. Eventually, peasants realized there was nothing left to give except their time and their temper. That's when revolts began. The pattern of medieval tax uprisings, nearly every peasant rebellion followed the same sleepy and predictable structure. A lord imposed one tax to many. Villagers murmured at the tavern. Someone said, "We could refuse." Someone else said, or hit them with agricultural tools. Things escalated. These uprisings were not planned by master tacticians. They were powered by emotional exhaustion and bad fiscal policy. And fear. Kings feared revolting peasants more than foreign armies, because peasants knew the land, outnumbered everyone, and were deeply motivated. Also, foreign armies rarely attacked with angry cows and burning hay carts, which seemed to have been surprisingly effective. England, the Peasants' Revolt of 1381. Let's drift to England. In 1381, the government introduced a new tax, the poll tax, a groundbreaking idea. Everyone had to pay the same amount, whether they were a wealthy merchant or a farmhand with a single surviving chicken. The logic was questionable. Officials were sent door to door to collect payment. Some performed invasive interrogations to uncover hidden income. That went poorly. Soon, thousands of peasants marched on London, led by men with deeply comforting names like Wat Tyler, Jack Straw, and John Ball, a priest who specialized in fiery sermons. The rebels burned tax records, opened prisons, forced meetings with government ministers. For a moment, they looked like they might win. Then the king promised reforms, invited Wat Tyler to negotiate, and had him killed mid-conversation. A classic medieval negotiating technique. The revolt collapsed, and the government reassured the peasants. We have learned lessons. They had not. France, the Jacquerie France of course, contributed its own revolt. In 1358, French peasants, tired of taxes, war, and nobles failing to defend anything, rose up in what became known as the Jacquerie, named after the generic term Jacques, the medieval French equivalent of calling peasants John does. The peasants attacked local lords, destroyed manor houses, and demanded changes. Unfortunately, they lacked unity, they lacked weaponry, and they faced nobles eager to demonstrate what their large horses were for. The revolt was crushed with historic brutality. French chroniclers blamed the peasants for daring to rise above their status, conveniently ignoring how consistently bad noble leadership had been, a soothing reminder that medieval historians were not always subtle. The Low Countries. When peasants negotiated in the Low Countries, modern Belgium and the Netherlands, peasants took a different approach. They revolted many times, but often occupied towns, held councils, negotiated written agreements. They didn't always win, but they achieved something rare: recognition that peasants had political leverage. It turns out that taxing people who grow your food is dangerous, especially if they can also withhold it. Many lords learned a valuable lesson. Peasants are adorable when obedient, terrifying when organized. Germany. Peasants get theological. The German lands added a twist. The 1524 Peasants' War, an uprising inspired partly by the Reformation. Some peasants read new religious arguments and concluded, if God believes in spiritual equality, maybe landlords should too. A revolutionary thought. Peasants listed grievances in documents like the 12 Articles, essentially a medieval manifesto asking for reasonable things like fair taxation, freedom to fish and hunt, and not being treated like livestock. Unfortunately, the revolt faced professional armies, powerful princes, and Martin Luther's refusal to support open violence. Luther's advice was essentially, reform yes, stabbing no, not the rallying cry peasants hoped for. The revolt ended badly, but it marked the moment when European peasants moved from complaining privately to stating their political rights in writing. Progress, on parchment. Why peasants rarely won? Peasants had heart. They had numbers. They even had occasional tactical surprises, such as, what if we attack at night with every tool from the barn? But they lacked cavalry, armor, money, long-term leadership, and rulers always had professional soldiers, mercenaries, or vassals desperate to prove loyalty. So, peasant revolts usually ended with executions, new fines, and sometimes more taxes to pay for the uprising. An impressive medieval feedback loop. Bad tax policy gives revolt, gives more tax to fix the revolt. Economically questionable, but revolt changed things anyway. Even failed uprisings had effects. Laws improved slowly. Monarchs became cautious. Taxation systems had to be justified publicly. Kings realized taxation without communication led to pitchfork diplomacy. Even medieval rulers eventually learned you cannot treat peasants like coin machines forever. People at the bottom notice, and sooner or later they stop paying in the traditional manner and begin paying in torches. A soft transition. Let's breathe out. Because now that we've covered kings, nobles, the church, and peasants, it's time to drift to another overlooked group in medieval fiscal drama: royal children, born into power, and usually destined for misery.